My name is Igor ISTOMIN. I am teaching here in MGIMO, and I have a great privilege to moderate this very prominent panel. And the panel is, the title of the panel is "Easing Great Power Crisis," and I think it is related very much with the ending of the previous panel, when there was a talk about the relation between geopolitics and economics, what should come first, what should come second. And while I was preparing for this panel, I just looked into the two major documents of the two powers that we are about to speak about. The one is the Russian foreign policy concept, which emerged in 2016, which says that, for example, in one of the statements, that attempts by Western powers to maintain their positions in the world, including by imposing their point of view on global processes and conducting a policy to contain alternative centers of power, leads to even more instability in international relations and more turbulence. That's the Russian official document from 2016, and the American official document, famous national security strategy of America First, last year was saying that China and Russia challenge American power, influence and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. They're determined to make economies less free and fair, to grow their militaries, and to control information, to repress societies and expand their influence. So we obviously see that there is much more of great power politics nowadays. And the question is, to what extent this kind of competition rivalry could be manageable. So we have a great panel, as I said, to deal with these very questions. Let me start with presenting this panel. We have Professor Vitaly NAUMKIN, Academic Director of the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences, member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is also the chair of the Department of Area Studies at Lomonosov Moscow State University. Previously, many years ago, he graduated from Moscow State University, from Institute of Asia and Africa Studies, and worked in this university as well. He is the leading Russian specialist and great mind on Middle Eastern affairs, but also on questions of strategy and foreign policy. We also have here Christopher Miller as an assistant professor of international history at Fletcher School, Tufts University, who previously served and worked in a number of prestigious institutions, including Yale University, New Economic School in Moscow, and a number of American think tanks. And a short advertisement, this year his second book is published. It is devoted to Russia, Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. Also on the far left from me is Professor Tatyana SHAKLEINA, who is the chair at the Department of Applied International Political Analysis here in MGIMO. Professor SHAKLEINA joined the university in 2006, and before that, for several decades, she worked at the Institute of US and Canada Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. I have to say that among the many courses that Professor SHAKLEINA delivers here in MGIMO, there is one particularly relevant to our panel. It is devoted to the great power politics. And moreover, last year, a second edition of her magisterial book, Russia and the US and World Politics, was published, of course she could also share her insights based on her research and teaching here in MGIMO. So I think we have a great opportunity to debate, but to make it even more lively and to engage our audience, I would like to ask kindly our great panelists to try to have their initial remarks for 10 minutes so that we have opportunity for the questions from the audience. Professor NAUMKIN, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's 10 minutes. It's great. Very generous offer. So, given the inventory of questions mentioned in your program, so I'll mention briefly some of the main ideas of my presentation, only in brief. So far, we're speaking about the current period as a new era of great power rivalry. It's correct to a certain extent, but I would rather say that there is not only rivalry between great powers, but probably a rivalry between all. It's a very competitive era, a lot of competition about resources, power, and a lot of other things. So we have growing number of hot spots in the world. Almost everywhere we have a sort of conflictual relationship, not only between the global powers, but also between different regional powers, even those that have been partners for quite a considerable period of time. So the question is to what extent so we can improve, we're able to improve our relationship, what are the remedies to the existing conflictual relationship, which sometimes is described as a new Cold War, whether it's correct or not. So I would say that it's clear that the present crisis is harmful to the interests of Russia. It's clear that this war of sanctions is biting, though there are also some positive sides of those sanctions in providing more opportunities for the Russian economy to develop or to replace imports with local production. But at the same time, we cannot hide from and probably this is our common ground that can push us towards some reconciliation, that there are also damaging dimensions of the present crisis for the United States. For instance, we can say that it decreases American security in the view of many strategic analysts in the United States, because the former period created strategic stability between Russia and the United States. Now it's more or less the departure of these achievements is harmful to the interests of the United States, as well as the interests of Russia. Also, war against nuclear proliferation is being damaged by this confrontation between Russia and the United States, and given that for the United States, maybe more than for Russia, it's a real, challenge. So the United States has been always very sensitive more sensitive than Russia towards nuclear proliferation. And the question of Iran, which is now very dividing not only Russia and the United States, but the United States and the Europeans, this question will be decisive in shaping our conflictual relationship in the short run. To what extent are we able to develop it or to change this relationship or to provide some ground for cooperation on the issue of Iran and in general, in a broader sense, on the issue of nuclear proliferation? It's not clear, but so Korea probably North Korea is more promising example, but not for sure. So the same thing about that even confrontation with Russia, in the view of many American observers, is harmful in the terms of raising taxes. If we take last 2 decades, the U.S. defense budget almost has doubled. In 1997, from $346 billion to the next year, it will be $716 billion. So, of course, every citizen of the United States will see the damaging effect of this growth of taxes necessary for funding this huge defense budget. Of course, the issue of the results or the consequences of sanctions in Russia, it's also not as predicted or desired by the United States. So more isolation in the Western Hemisphere, though not as much isolated as the United States wishes, and the more anti-American, which is not very good. The different issues of, confronting each other with either foreign interference or foreign agency, whatever it is, it's also harmful towards better understanding. But thinking about what could be done, of course, we believe that there should be a new attitude developed by the United States towards Russia. Only this can save us from deepening this conflictual relationship. So it can serve protection of the United States security, and as well as as the security and strategic stability for Russia. We have this common interest. So in principle, interests are lying on the values. So we have difference in values, as many people believe. We have more common grounds in the field of interests. But if you compare, because China is mentioned here in this very panel, we can see that probably there are more common values between Russia and the United States than between China and the United States. But at the same time, there are more interests between the United States and China than between Russia and the United States. Probably it's true, probably it's not. Anyhow, preventing further nuclear proliferation is clearly a vital interest of both Russia and the United States, as well as the struggle against terrorism and some efforts towards global security. So, threat of the spread of international terrorism is also one of the possible consequences of going further on in this, either Cold War or something similar to Cold War. To prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction is also a common interest that is workable as bringing us closer towards each other. Deepening and broadening contacts between U.S. and the American and Russian peoples. It's almost frozen. It's surprisingly, almost that doesn't exist anymore. We can say that there are, frightening numbers. In 2016, only 240,000 Americans visited Russia, and more than 15 million of Americans visited Europe. At the same time, 8 million Ukrainians from not very friendly Ukraine, and 1.2 million Chinese spent time in Russia in 2017. Then compare these numbers. And, which is much worse than that, the State Department officially is still discouraging U.S. citizens from traveling to Russia, considering it level 3 ranking, which means not recommended for travel because of the possible, terrorism and harassment. Is it true that is it so difficult to be in Moscow? Those of you who are coming to Russia and visiting our great city. And medicine, arts, religion, books publishing, everything is so depressing that even we can see now that, for instance, because of the sanctions, the ballet dancers of the Bolshoi Theater cannot receive visas to the United States. Okay, if you are punishing so-called green men in the Crimea, зеленых человечков, да, наказываете, why are you hurting the blue men? Голубых-то за что наказывать? Совершенно ни к чему. Они тут ни при чем. So, in So we're coming to Ukraine. We're coming to the most sensitive issue of Crimea. Let's remember what happened with the Baltic states during the old Soviet days, when the United States didn't recognize the Baltic states as members of the republics of the Soviet Union, but nothing happened. No sanctions, no any deterioration in relationship. Why not to use the same approach, given that the Crimea will be a part of Russia forever? Nobody is going in this country, regardless whether it's Putin or whoever, can give up the Crimea. It's clear. So why to continue sanctions, not to find some sort of formula in order not to allow it to spoil our relationship? Nobody is so naive than to wait until you recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. But you can delay this question, you can postpone it, you can take it as a fait accompli. And why are you punishing the people of Crimea who are deprived of the mere human right of traveling? They cannot get visas at all. So why? If you are again punishing someone, but what is the fault of the citizens of Crimea? The Americans, the United States has been always demanding from the Soviet Union to pay full respect to the right of traveling, but not for the citizens of Crimea. They simply voted for being citizens of Russia, nothing more. What is their fault? It's very clear that something should be done, not continuing endlessly sanctions that cannot make the situation less dangerous. It's very dangerous. And we have to think about how to avoid this issue. The same about the membership of Ukraine and some other states of the CIS in NATO. It only can create only the illusion of greater security for Ukraine or whoever, even if this or that government wants to join NATO. So why this question hasn't been discussed properly well between Russia and the United States? So how much time is left for me? 1 minute, 2 minutes? 2 minutes. 2 minutes is great, I think that these are the main lines where we have to focus, focus on the possible breakthroughs, especially providing grounds for, at least for relationship between citizens, civil societies, as well as between officials, not to freeze it totally. And sometimes, so I personally can't understand why the sanctions are against people like, if we take businesses like Deripaska, for instance. He has nothing to do with the so-called inner circle in Kremlin, and has been always a good partner for the American businesses. There should be some very positive signals from the United States that the United States is not seeking for regime change in Russia. At least it's perceived as that by many of the citizens in this country. So, and the United States should take seriously Russia's security concerns. We can work constructively together as we work, despite of our differences on the Syrian issue. We've been working very constructively in Syria in creating a new zone of de-escalation in the southwestern part of Syria. It was a new triangle between Russia and the United States and Jordan, supported from behind by Israel as well. And the results are very clear, very positive. So the conflict between dialect in this part of the world was also very constructive. I know that very well because I was involved in some of the formats of this, cooperation. So I think that so we can work on the issue of some basic common interests and trying to improve the situation. Otherwise, it can slip into real disaster and create more threats to global and regional security. Nobody wants to turn these tensions, disagreements to turn into a new war between Russia and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Naumkin appealed to a very dear issue for any American citizens, to taxes, and how costly is the confrontation. Christopher Miller is also working not only on Russia-American relations, but also now on Russian Eastern policy. So maybe he will be able to take from here and to talk also the role of China in these triangular relations.
Well, thank you, Professor ISTOMIN, for that introduction. And indeed, I was planning to start with China, because not only because that was one of the 4 questions that I was tasked with answering, but also because the rise of China over the past quarter century, I think, presents something of a puzzle for understanding U.S.-Russia relations. Because both the United States and Russia have a history of very complicated relations with China. Over the past century, both countries have been at the brink of war with China numerous times. The political systems of China and Russia and China and the United States are quite different. In economic ties, there's reasons for cooperation, but also, as we're seeing right now in U.S.-Chinese relations, reason for conflict as well. And yet, nonetheless, as China has risen in power over the past 25 years, it's the U.S. and Russia that have struggled to get along, even as both the United States and China and Russia and China have had periods of relatively good relations. On the Russia-Chinese front, I think if you talk to people in Beijing and in Moscow, most people will say that relations are the best they've been in at least 50 years. On the U.S.-China front, it's a bit more complicated, but nonetheless, I think it is something of a surprise as to how easily China's rise has been managed thus far. It's created some friction, but not that much, given how significant of a country China is and the challenge that it poses to U.S. power in the Asia-Pacific region. So when I think of how historians 50 years or 75 years down the road will write about the international politics of the past quarter century, I wonder whether they're going to write books about how neither the United States nor Russia properly grappled with the rise of China because they were too busy focusing on their own disputes. And I think that's certainly one interpretation of what we're seeing right now. But the second question that was posed in the set of issues to discuss in this panel were prospects for normalization on the U.S. and Russia front. And I think in both countries there was hope that fear of China would prompt the other country to come to the table with concessions over Ukraine or over Syria. And that hasn't happened yet on either side. In the United States, the administration, as Professor ISTOMIN noted, has declared both Russia and China as major power competitors. And there's been no change in Russian policy towards China in recent years, despite some U.S. hope that China's rise will in fact cause many in Moscow to fear China. So it seems that we shouldn't count on China's rise to produce any sort of improvement in U.S.-Russian relations. It hasn't happened thus far, and it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. It's hard to predict 50 years down the road, but certainly in the 5 or 10-year time horizon, I don't think China's going to cause either the United States or Russia to improve bilateral ties on their own. So if we want better bilateral ties, therefore we need to do it ourselves. We need to find some sort of way to relate to each other better. And I think the title of our panel right now, Great Power Rivalry, suggests that relations are never going to be easy between our countries. They haven't been over the past 100 years, and so I don't think there's any reason to suggest they'll be easy over the next 100 years. But they certainly can be better than they are today. There's no doubt about that. It was only 5 years ago when we were still living at the end of the last reset in U.S.-Russian relations, and even to get back to that point, which was far from perfect, I think would be quite an accomplishment. And obviously you can't just rewind the clock back, so it's a question of how do you move forward and get to a better place than we are today. And there are a couple of issues that I think, and this is picking up on what Professor NAUMKIN said, a couple of issues where I do think there might be some potential for agreement in the future. One issue which I think we haven't discussed enough today is the arms control agenda, the nuclear weapons control agenda, which is currently in the state of near collapse. If we look forward just a couple of years, barring any sort of new agreement between the U.S. and Russia, arms control might no longer be functioning at all. And that's an area where both countries blame the other side for violating the agreements, as we heard earlier today. It also seems to me to be an area where there ought to be a lot more focus on agreement. And certainly if I were advising the U.S. government, which is not really thinking about this issue much at all, the U.S. government is actually in the midst of a $1 trillion nuclear modernization program, which is not really designed to pressure Russia or to contain Russia. It's just done focusing as much on China as it is on Russia. So that's an interesting view into how the Pentagon is thinking about this issue. But if I were advising them, I would say, actually, this might be a way in which we can rebuild some trust between the U.S. and Russia, where we can cut our defense spending without necessarily compromising our security, and resolve not only some specific bilateral U.S.-Russia issues, but actually the entire European security agenda depends upon arms control functioning. And so this is an issue that is of great interest to the British and the French and the Germans and the Poles as well. So I would encourage a much greater focus on arms control over the next couple of years before things truly do fall apart. And the second issue, which I think is hard to be optimistic about given the past 4 years, but I think nonetheless we must return to, is the issue of Ukraine. And of course, I think my Russian colleagues will remind me immediately that it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about European security more broadly. But I think there is an event next year in Ukraine which might give us some possible reason to have more hope than we do this year, and that's, of course, the set of elections that Ukraine will have next year. I think the fact that Ukraine is going into presidential and parliamentary elections in 2019 gives all sides no incentive to compromise until then. Poroshenko is not going to compromise because he has an election campaign to win. The United States and Europe are not compromising because they're hoping to convince Russia that when another Ukrainian president comes to power who is also anti-Russian, the West hopes will realize that Ukraine is not going to go back into Russia's sphere of influence. And Russia, I think, is hoping for a candidate to win in Ukraine that is more amenable to negotiations than Poroshenko is. So right now, all three of the main parties in the debate have reason to hope that 2019 might bring them something more favorable. And I have no idea who's going to win the election in Ukraine. I suggest that no one in this room has any idea, given how unpredictable Ukrainian politics are. But what we do know is that after 2019, we'll have more clarity as to what will be politically possible in Ukraine, what the correlation of forces will be in Ukraine. And therefore, I think there'll be more possibility of having a productive dialogue on the question of the Donbass. And I would, I think, building off of Professor NAUMKIN's comments, encourage us to think separately about the Crimea issue and the Donbass issue, in part because the issue of sanctions that was brought up before, the U.S. and Western sanctions, both the U.S. and the EU sanctions are different for Crimea than for the Donbass. And the economically significant ones are the ones on the Donbass. And the U.S. and the EU have been very clear that if that issue is resolved, then the sectoral sanctions could be lifted. And so Crimea is certainly a longer-term issue. It's certainly not going to be an easier issue, but it's conceivable that we could resolve the Donbass issue without resolving the Crimea issue. And that would be, I think, in my view, a success if we were to do that. Now, as I mentioned before, it's impossible to totally disconnect the question of Ukraine from the question of European security more broadly. Professor ISTOMIN and I teach a course on U.S.-Russian relations with students from Fletcher and MGIMO, and that's something that came out very clearly from our discussions this year, is that Americans only wanted to talk about the issues in Ukraine, and our Russian colleagues reminded us that, well, you must consider the broader issues of European security. And these are, of course, the really hard issues to deal with because they relate not only to the structure of any particular conflict, but to the broader question of how do you structure European institutions, NATO, and to a lesser extent, the European Union. And here, too, I don't think there are any magic answers. There's certainly been discussion of whether you could have a pledge that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. It's not clear that would be politically feasible in Washington or in Kiev. I think it's also worth asking whether there are ways we can use arms control to provide more reassurance both to the West and to Russia, not only in the nuclear front, but also, I think, the conventional arms control front is something we've been ignoring recently. When you look at debates in the Baltic Sea, for example, where Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia are very afraid of Russia's intentions, and in turn, Russia is afraid of NATO efforts to place more troops in the Baltics, I think there's an area where maybe we should be thinking again about whether conventional arms control can be resuscitated. Because it does seem to me that if we were to get the arms control agenda back on track, then it might be possible to have both sides feel more comfortable with the broader European security architecture. Not that everyone's going to be perfectly happy, but you might have enough progress to have that be sufficient to have progress in the Donbass issue. Thank you. And that leads to one final question, which was brought up before, which is the question of regime change or domestic interference. There's multiple different rubrics with which we can use to address this issue. And I think our discussion today has already brought forth that this is a very sensitive issue on both sides. It's an issue where I have very low confidence we're going to be able to find some sort of deal not to interfere in each other's politics, much as some might like that. And I think if we're going to think about how do we reduce the fear that Russians have of American meddling and the fear that Americans have of Russian meddling, I think the key is to resolve some of the foreign policy issues that make our relationship so complicated in the first place. And if you think back to before the war in Georgia, there was much less concern in Russia, certainly, about American meddling, and almost none in the United States about Russian meddling. And so I think if we were able to resolve some of the European security questions, then the concern about meddling would still be there, but probably in a much less active sense. And so if I were advising President Putin as he begins his new term, or President Trump as he thinks about relations with Moscow, those would be the issues that would be high on my agenda, although I think even still I'm not that optimistic about our success.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The remarks of Professor Miller reminded me the old American saying, déjà vu all over again, right? Once again, we are talking about arms control, about the nuclear stuff, focusing on the basics, so to say. And Professor Miller comes not just with some suggestions, but kind of a plan, three-step plan how we could make relations better. And of course, it's one of the topics on which Professor SHAKLEINA thought and worked very extensively, how to make Russian-American relations better. I remember a couple of years ago she wrote an article, that it's not maybe interests which could bring Russia and the US together, but common threats which could bring together.
Thank you, Igor, for introduction. Since I'm participating in the second MGIMO-Tufts University conference, I can compare, and I can say that this discussion that we have had today is even more comprehensive, more high level, I to say. We are rising even up in our discussions, and I think it's because we know each other better, and we understand already better. That's why the talk is becoming, to me at least, as I can evaluate it, more, as I said, comprehensive and more several different levels of discussion. When we put this question, what to do to improve the relations, I think we need to continue this way. Since we have this big audience of young people participating, and we have brilliant speakers from different fields of sciences, humanitarian and just natural sciences. We have so many topics discussed. This is the best way. And the supplement to it might be publications. I can give the example of the Soviet time when we had such publications as Breakthrough in Russian and English, when we had couples of scholars, Soviet and American, writing on the same topic in one chapter. The result of this kind of cooperation was better understanding, new thinking, and a mutual desire to finish the Cold War. These people who wrote the books and who participated in the bilateral projects were not going to destroy the Soviet Union or the United States. They were going to finish the Cold War with a mutual approach, mutual understanding, and they were planning to construct the future world without confrontation on a bilateral basis, both speaking about the Soviet Union and the United States. Now I think it might be also very useful if we write on the same topics, giving different views, different understanding, or maybe a very similar understanding on certain problems. Because as I understood from today's presentations, all of us want to cooperate. All of us want better relations between the countries that might influence the situation in the world in general. So that's why I present the first publication of the Russian and American scholars. This idea of making this publication, I brought this idea from Andrei Paikov and me. We brought this idea to Moscow from the Tufts University visit and conference to give the chance to our American colleagues and students to read what is written by Russians about Russian policy, about international relations. We have 2 American participants here. But I think we might make broader publications, and this is a very good chance for us to promote our ideas both in Russia and the United States. Russian students are in a more privileged position because all our students speak 3 languages. So all of them read English, internet sources, books, articles, everything. There's not so many American students who read and speak Russian, so it will be the opportunity for them to see how Russians are thinking about the world and international order and the United States and global problems. Since I'm the last in Boston, at the Tufts University conference, I was almost the last speaking at the conference. What was Andrei Baikov was after me, but I was almost the last one, sitting from 9 o'clock till 4 o'clock, listening to the presentations. And when you listen and when you have so many ideas coming to you, it's not easy then to speak at the end and give something that you planned to say before you have heard to all the speakers. The topic that I wanted to discuss, I chose it for myself, at least to mention it, is mass media, contemporary mass media in Russia and the United States. From my visits to the United States this year, last year, and 2016, I cannot say that I was very angry, but I was really angry, and I just, from time to time, I turned off TV that I was watching, then turned it on again because I wanted to follow what was going on in the United States in 2016 before the elections, and then after the elections. And in Russia, the reaction in Russia also before the elections and then after. You see, what is going on with the mass media, printed, electronic, TV, radio, all kinds of mass media. What is freedom of the press nowadays? How we do understand this freedom of the press in the United States and Russia and in the world in general, in other countries? Are there any moral restrictions for journalists who are writing and speaking on certain topics, on certain countries? Whether we can rely on the information that is presented in their own mass media sources? Because, for instance, when I was in Washington this year and I was there on Friday night when the American forces, Air Force, bombed the Syrian objects, and I was very much concerned that something didn't like it. Because we had military forces, Russian military forces in Syria, and we had now American campaign. I didn't like that. I was very much concerned about the possible consequences and in general with the situation. And when I watched TV the next day, I understood that there was nothing there actually, nothing serious. Because there was not so much information about it, only the statement about the victory, and some pictures that were absolutely openly demonstrated. There was nothing there, no chemical factories, no chemical weapons, nothing. The field was very clean, nice, beautiful. So, and as it turned out, when I came back to Moscow and I searched for information and I got some information, I was right. I didn't have any access to any information. I was sitting in the hotel on Friday and Saturday before I was going to leave, so I didn't have any serious meetings already. But my conclusion was right. So that's why I think it's time for us, for all of us, to raise this question, to analyze, so that we make some conclusions about the activities of the American and Russian press and mass media, because they often spoil the relations and they spoil the images. They they bring damage, serious damage to the relations between the countries and the people. But I don't have time to dwell on this topic. My first dissertation was devoted to the freedom of the press in the United States in the 80s with the Reagan administration and just the history of the question. And now when sometimes I sit and think, what should I write about? I don't see any topic to write about because, as it was mentioned, we are like in a dead alley in sometimes at the discussions. There's nothing to discuss because sometimes the questions are in the form of ultimatum. And when you have these ultimatums coming from facing you, you don't know actually how to continue the conversation. So I just put this topic just for further discussion and further maybe meetings and conferences. And I wanted just maybe to say something. For instance, when there's so much talk about China, and Eurasian integration is compared to Chinese Silk plans. And I say, Russia has been working in the field of integration, making some projects, keeping countries together, helping countries, putting money into the projects for 27 years after 1999. And all these 27 years, I just heard only criticism coming from Russians and from Americans. But 27 years is something. China was doing nothing in this field. He was just collecting money just from foreign investments. And now that it has a lot of money, it suggests the project. We'll see whether China succeeds in anything in its projects. So that's why I have serious doubts about that. That's why we'll see what will happen with the Eurasian integration, with the Chinese plans to integrate all these countries and to become the second, because I think it is a strategic project, not just economic. It is a strategic project, and the aim is not only economy, it's also politics and dominance, and maybe the role in the world order. Do we want China to be the domineering European countries, Russia, the United States? It's a big question. So I think for the next discussion we might also concentrate maybe more pragmatically on the mutual interests of the United States and Russia, real interests for the future world order, for the future international order, and regional order, taking into account the European interests. So I don't have time. Professor ISTOMIN, you see, he is famous for his very pressing attitude about time. And students know it very well. I am very liberal. I give more time for presentations in class. He doesn't give any time. So I obey.
Thank you so much, Professor SHAKLEINA. It actually just for the sake of having debate, because I'm sure that we have a lot of questions. And please, microphone, Mikhail. Oh. And then Dmitry.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, thank you. So my name is Mikhail Polyansky. I'm a first-year master student here in MGIMO. And I wanted to ask a question about unpredictability. We all know that it's probably one of the biggest questions in science of politics in general. And, well, I'm not an expert in the U.S. in general, but I have a feeling that President Trump might be the president who really means what he says. So he might be one of the most predictable presidents. Like, if we look at the TTIP, for instance, he said that he's going to crush it, he did that. So he said that he's going to withdraw from Iran deal. He really did that. So he also said that he's going to improve relations with Russia. So do you think he's going to fulfill this promise? Or so it might be one of the first times that he didn't really mean that. Thank you.
Well, let me, I don't know that I'm an expert on Donald Trump, but I'll try. I think you're right to point out there's a couple of ways that he followed through on his campaign promises in ways that other politicians might not have. But next to that, I would put several instances where he hasn't followed through or he has redefined his goals in the process of claiming that he's following through. So, for example, if you look at the current trade negotiations with China, at first he was going to get a reduction in the U.S.-China bilateral trade deficit of $100 billion, and it was increased to $200 billion. And then last weekend there was a kind of a halfway deal that didn't involve any numbers like that at all. So it seems like the goalposts are changing on a regular basis in this negotiation. So it would be hard for me to say that on the U.S.-China trade front, for example, he's following through. Similarly, on North Korea, which you probably have seen today already, the summit has been canceled. They won't meet in June. Here, too, it's not clear what the president himself wants to do with North Korea. Indeed, if you've watched the interviews when the media asks him about his plans for North Korea, he seems to bumble around and not really know what he's talking about. And I will contrast that with his advisors, who are, of course, very well informed, and you can agree or disagree. But there's a lot of detail and nuance in between the various types of concessions that the North might give on its nuclear program, and denuclearization is almost certainly not one of them. And the definition of denuclearization has changed pretty significantly in Trump's statements over time. So I'm less confident that Trump is, in fact, the person who knows how to deliver on what he wants to deliver, or indeed that he knows what he wants to deliver in a sustained way over time. But on the U.S.-Russia front, here, too, I think it's not exactly clear that Trump had a thought-out plan as to what better U.S.-Russian relations meant when he came to power. I think he clearly thought he could get along with Putin in some sort of better way. Had he ever thought about what the Ukraine crisis entailed or the war in Syria in a serious way? That's not really clear to me. And, to be sure, there are people who were around him who thought you could do deals over Ukraine and Syria and had better plans, but the president himself, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Now, even more interesting than that is the extent to which the U.S. political system in general has worked to constrain U.S.-Russian relations. And this has been a fact that's been persistent over time, that Congress and the media play a large role in determining policy towards Russia. Not only the White House, and this dates back to the Soviet period too, this was also true. So I think when you're looking at Trump's willingness or ability to improve relations with Russia, the question is not only what does Trump want to do or what can he do, but also what will Congress and the media let him do.
Maybe we will follow a bit different order than in previous panels and take several questions because we are a bit short of time. And then Professor Streltsov, потом Professor Kozin.
Very short, maybe not question, maybe this is the remark. I think that today we discuss powers, great powers in world politics, dealing with comparison between the United States and Russia and their approaches to different issues of international politics. But dealing with the reasons for such policy, we should not ignore the domestic aspects for such policy. Some points were already discussed during our last session, and I would like to dwell on the fact that what should be discussed is the so-called difference of public attitudes to public policy, to international policy, to foreign policy in both states. I would like to say that for a long time the United States and the Soviet Union were the only superpowers in the bipolar world, and this fact formed a specific view, a specific perspective over world affairs in both countries, when in both countries public sentiment was formed on the consciousness of superiority. And this, so to say, specificity of public consciousness persists nowadays, because in the United States, the hawkish views of foreign policy establishment bases on very conservative views of ordinary citizens, or the electors who demand the America First approach, and the political leaders are very sensitive of these views. And the Trump phenomena is only the reflection of this fact. And in Russia, the foreign policy also is the product of Cold War. Even nowadays, though Cold War is already gone for 30 years, but the so to say the consciousness of so to say, losing in Cold War, the idea that Russia is not the only one of two superpowers, the victimized approach and the trauma of being lost in Cold War is still alive in the so to say, in the minds of many ordinary citizens, and there is a strong demand for restoring the position of Russia as maybe one of superpowers which is equal to other superpowers like America and China. Therefore, there is a, so to say, space for comparing the two phenomena which give rise to these hawkish views, to hawkish approach to foreign policy. And the last thing I would like to say that when we meet during such conferences, we understand that we have much more in common, and we share different views. We share our views on different international problems. Therefore, all such confrontation is mostly, to a large extent, the result of domestic discourse in both countries, which is not always rational, but it reflects public sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Vladimir Petrovich,
thank you very much. I'm Vladimir Kozin. I'm also a graduate of MGIMO in 1972, so a little bit later than Dr. NAUMKIN. Two remarks concerning your remarks, sir. Military activity in the Baltic Sea area. Unfortunately, Russia is greatly concerned that from 2004, 15 NATO member states are conducting Baltic air policing operation. The operation is not so frightening per se, but in one way it's very alarming for us, because 3 Western nuclear powers are involving in this operation. It's 24 hours a day running. They're all year round. They can carry tactical nuclear weapons, and we do not know whether they do that or not. One. Second, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. You probably have heard that Donald Trump canceled the meeting in Singapore. That's a very bad announcement. But on the other hand, there is a room of opportunity to meet, because President Trump, in his personal letter to President in Russia, he said that somewhere in the future, I'm looking forward that our meeting would take place. Just let me know, in a written or any other way. I'm a person who is fond of practical solutions. Look, ladies and gentlemen, just 5 practical solutions how to improve our relationship. Second, why not to subscribe to a no first use clause? We are still having detargeting agreement. It's one step. Why not a second step forward, especially in the case when Democratic Party of the United States is debating this kind of issue. Second, why not to reach an agreement on limiting the total number of strategic BMDS, ballistic missile defense interceptors, in terms of quantity and in terms of a geographical layout, geographical employment, fielding, etc. Third, it would be also possible to reach an accord not to field for more than 24 hours any kind of nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons on the basis of reciprocity, be it strategic or tactical, or low-yield nuclear weapons. And two more. Why not to sign a bilateral treaty banning space-based striking weapons, including ASAT, in Russian PSS, противоспутниковые системы, and BMDS interceptors in space. And final brush, a new CFE treaty is knocking this door. We badly need it. So these are initial steps. Why not to think about them? The other might follow, but this is very symbolic, especially the first notion, no first use. It's cheap. No reductions. It's a confidence-building measure. It will be much better. Thank you very much. By the way, my report, it's only just like this. It has been already emplaced on our website called CVPI MGIMO. So please find it. But for all 4 speakers, I have already secured 4 copies in English. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please, if we have some responses to these 2 comments.
Well, I think certainly with the direction of your comments, I completely agree. I think the specific issues that you raised are things that obviously would have to be negotiated among the parties. But personally speaking, nuclear no first use, thank you, is something that I would support. But broadly speaking, yes, I think your question about arms control is a good idea. On the CFE, I think that's a much more interesting and complicated question, in part because the old CFE, I think there's no chance that the 2 sides could find a way to resuscitate the old CFE. So it's a question of, can you find a new CFE and find a new name for it? And your comments about the Baltic Sea, I think, were striking in part because if you go to Riga, if you go to Tallinn, you'll hear a very similar fear coming from a different direction. And so that suggests to me that there is actually room for discussions that would reduce the level of conventional and also strategic tension in the region. So I would certainly encourage both negotiations on the nuclear front and also the conventional front. In Washington, that's not happening basically at all. There's a bit of conversation about nuclear, none about conventional. I'm not sure what conversations are happening in Moscow, but I'd be interested to learn more because it does seem to me that both sides have an interest in making sure that nuclear war doesn't happen. And so it's a matter of finding out how we can get there.
Thank you. Please, further questions? Yes, Victoria. And then Brandon.
Thank you for all speakers. Victoria Fedosova, master student, MGIMO. My question is about the attitude of people and attitude of countries, of course. In the United States, for example, we can see what I dare to call secondary world vision. We can see it manifesting itself in the economy as we see households and the entire state being indebted. And as it has already been mentioned, media providing data but not facts. In Russia, in contrast to it, we see so-called primary world. Russian media ask to provide Russian government with facts, and that's the official position of Russian MFA. And we also see a great number of households, as well as our government, trying to manage real budget and not financial expectations and just debt. So is there a chance higher that the United States goes back to so-called realist approach with data, with real proofs, with real numbers, or we see Russia trying to apply techniques of this secondary world? Thank you.
Thank you. And as we agreed, 2 questions we take in a row, please.
Sure. Okay. My name is Brandon Hohengarten. I'm a third-year student at Occidental College, and my question is particularly in response to Mr. NAUMKIN. This is in regards to your statements on sanctions, but first I would like to provide a frame of reference, because really what I would like to do is look at this in the converse, because you said that sanctions do not produce results, and that may be true on the political end for America. However, I do believe it presents opportunities for Russia. You painted this very Hobbesian picture characterized by postmodern geopolitical hard power that has like only semi-isolated Russia and also essentially exacerbated tensions through the sanctions themselves. You know, U.S.-Russia relations are at the worst point that they've been at for a very long period of time. However, sanctions are designed to serve more than just political purposes. You know, they're also symbolic and economic. And Symbolically, essentially what I'm getting at is that there's been this long trend in the degradation of the relationship between the EU and Russia regardless, especially as sectoral dialogues collapsed going into the late 2000s. Summits and ministerial meetings stopped happening, and in addition to that, trade actually started declining already in 2012 with Russia's WTO ascension. Each year after that, accompanied with disputes within the WTO, and those were mutually founded between the EU and Russia. But now, however, and also I believe that a symptom of this, this degradation of institutions has also been the soft power conflict that we saw in Ukraine, which has also led to the sanctions that were up for discussion today. So now, however, despite the sanctions, the volume of trade is increasing, and the relationship between the EU and Russia is showing potential for normalization, and there is much more political will for cooperation between the two. Moreover, based on the hegemonic actions of the United States, pressure put on NATO, there is also more potential for EU to become strategically autonomous and start looking away from the United States, trying to develop security relationships. And I think Russia is positioned, essentially to continue building confidence, particularly with the presence of issues like Iran and North Korea, where there's already been cooperation with European countries and also a stable partner that they have within China that they've had long-term relationships with. And moreover, relationships between Russia and China are getting much, much better thanks to triangle diplomacy and horizontal security. So there's all sorts of prospects for sanctions to actually produce results on Russia's end of the bargain based on overreaching U.S. policies. So my question to you is, particularly given that it has been mentioned multiple times that sanctions are here to stay, I think really complaining about it is like beating a dead horse. So my question is, what do you see as, and if you could wrap up the question. Yeah. My question to you is, how do you think Russia could become more flexible and dynamic in order to respond to these conditions and essentially increase its own geopolitical status and take advantage of the environment despite the obvious disadvantages that are put in place? And I think, unfortunately, it is the last set of questions that we could have, so please, if you'd like to respond to anything, do it now.
Sorry, I have a couple of remarks because it was a very long explanation, good addition to our discussion, but plus one probably question. So I would like to tackle the issue of some consequences of some interesting dimensions of the sanctions. To what extent these sanctions can, be applied against those, states that have a substantial volume of trade, for instance, with such states as Iran, which is important for Russia, for instance. To what extent Russia can be punished for having deals with Iran in case Iran is under tougher sanctions, which is going to happen. And by the way, it's also providing some ground for more cooperation between Russia and the European Union, which is not willing also to surrender. And to what extent the European states are capable to withstand the American pressures or to avoid these measures if the United States is willing to use sanctions against the European Union in case the European Union wants to develop a trade relationship, to continue deals with Iran, for instance. And so there is a number of questions which makes probably create some ground for cooperation between Russia and the European Union, which is contradictory, paradoxical. At the same time, there is some new common ground from these sanctions or some common interest. Some people believe, some analysts, between Russia and the United States, given, for instance, the increase of the oil prices, which is beneficial for the United States, because the United States can benefit from this rise of oil prices by selling its shale oil, and at the same time it's profitable for the Russian companies. So paradoxically, we can say that we can, although I don't buy this, but some people believe that, so it's okay, what the United States is doing, it's in the interests of both Russia and the United States. And on the opposite view is no, on the contrary, these sanctions against Iran is harming relations, harming the interests of the European Union, and is bringing both Russia and the European Union and China closer to each other.
You see, you have said so much about Russia and the sanctions, so I don't know actually what to add to your material, but I just refer to the words of one of my American colleagues who said that Russia has always had a lot of economic problems, but it has always remained a great power. So Russia has this disparity between economy and great power behavior. I think since we have this tradition, people will continue being a great power despite the difficulties. And since Russia is a self-sufficient country, the richest country in the world, and the people of Russia are people very devoted to the country and used to hardships. So they will survive and they will find waves of innovation and change. Every day, when we discuss with my American colleagues why Russia doesn't disappear from world politics, I had these questions. There were hopes that Russia will weak and will disappear, but it doesn't happen. What is the reason for that? One of the answers is that Russia is not only the richest country in the world and the biggest and the richest and self-sufficient. It produces every minute talented people. We have a lot of talented people. We have scientific schools that still exist from the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. That's why whatever conditions we have very many people who are willing to take the country forward, higher. And they don't. It was said here today that most talented people leave the country. It's not true. Most talented people stay in the country. They are very talented, and so it's my hope. I see talented people every day in my classrooms and among my colleagues. Of course, I cannot say that we're happy with the sanctions, but still I think we'll manage to make reforms, to go further, to keep the status, and I think we'll manage to agree with the United States and with even more with China. So we'll find ways, since we have a lot of opportunities now in the East, we'll use them to our profit. The problem is to use them effectively and to, as it was correctly said by Professor Greenberg, still there is this big task to be economical with finance, to fulfill the programs that we presented, and to fight corruption. So if we fulfill these tasks, we'll manage to overcome the sanctions, and sanctions will be lifted. Because I think that The only maybe I don't like this idea, but there are some. I heard it and I read about it, and my students read the publications by Americans, for instance, Bruce Jones publications and some other people publications, where they don't mention Russia in world politics. And we know Parag Khanna publications, who and George Friedman provocative publications that by 2025 there will be no Russia as the Russian Federation on the map of the world. So it will disappear as this kind of country. Maybe it is the aim of the politics of the United States. I don't know. I don't believe in it. I don't want to believe in it. But if it's the task, if it's the aim, then they will never stop in the implementation of any politics aiming at the weakening of Russia closer to dissolution. My very respected colleague, Viktor Kremenyuk, Professor Viktor Kremenyuk from the Institute of USA and Canada, and Professor Bogaturov from MGIMO, they wrote the article in the Nezavisimaya Gazeta in 1996, and the title was "Americans will never stop. Американцы не остановятся никогда." 1996 was the beginning of the deterioration in Russian-American relations. 22 years after, Americans are not stopping. And my question is whether, maybe Americans will answer my question, whether the United States will stop impressing Russia and maybe just dealing with Russia in this way, coming us back to confrontation. I'm not speaking about the new Cold War, but about confrontation. That's why I think our conference is very important. And besides the mass media issue, I think we need to speak more of history. What I noticed, many people in the United States don't know history, international history, Russian history, and the history of Russian-American relations. Our students also, not all of them, know the history very well of Russian-American relations, especially of the Soviet time. That's why in this book we included the chapter on the Crimean history, so that at least the short variant of the history of the Crimea, so that American readers at least have a glimpse of this very important topic. This is my answer. You are not satisfied, but it's a very serious conversation and many-faceted. You cannot give a simple answer to that. And there's a lot of expectations on both sides. Positive on the right side, maybe negative on the American side. I don't know. But since we're finishing, just let me say just a few words about the organization of the conference. The first one at the Tufts University was a brilliant one. It was so very well organized and it was so interesting. So many people attended. And this one also, to me, just very well organized, just a great event for our cooperation. And I wanted to give tribute to two people. All of participants were great. But I wanted to say a few words about Professor Dresner and Professor Baikov, two people who so devotedly organized this event. I know it because Professor Baikov, I see him almost every day, and I know how busy he is. So, and Professor Dresner also, I saw him at the ISA convention. I wanted to thank them very much for their efforts. And I hope that this cooperation will continue and we'll have this chance of the dialogue between the representatives of the academic community and of the younger generation who will be our future, who will take our place in formulating American and Russian foreign policies, economic policies, all kinds of policies. Thank you very much for this conference.
Thank you very much. Actually, our panel ends with a debt, because I think we haven't answered Victoria's question. So I would be very grateful if Chris afterwards could respond as an American, because I think it was the question more to the Americans, how the U.S. media will operate in future and how they will change. So maybe afterwards, after our panel, we will be able to pay our debt to you. Then I have very important announcement, because now there will be the most important part of our conference, something for what you all came. So Dan Dresner and Andrei Baikov in 15 minutes will try to make sense of everything that happened today. And this will happen without any pause, without any break, so please stay in your seats. It will be short, concise version of the today's day and what going may be ahead. Thank you so much, and I would like to thank finally the wonderful panelists for your contribution and the wonderful audience for your participation in our great panel. Thank you so much.
We'll be very quick, and actually we'll finish on time, because we've agreed with Dan to limit our remarks to under 5 minutes. And those, as I promised, who survive will be rewarded. So I would like to make just 3 points, maybe 4, it depends. My first point is that I think we've come very close to setting the world record of surviving through the longest academic conference in the history. It actually consists of 9 panels and not 7. I recalculated, I think it is unprecedented. And there is the second reason why it's the record setter. We roughly see the same number of faces at the end of the conference as actually saw 12 hours ago. Even though the faces certainly are not all the same, it actually shows that there's been some dynamic going on. My second point is that I'm somehow puzzled that even though we specifically said that the goal of this conference is to talk about cooperation, and the goal of the previous conference was to talk about disagreements, it's turned out the other way around. Because I clearly remember that last time I was very disappointed somehow that all participants wanted to talk about the good stuff and the areas of cooperation, and I thought that the idea was first to do the inventory of what the differences are in various areas, and then to move to building up areas of cooperation. I think for some reason, no matter what task we set before our participants, it's so difficult to kind of forget about all those differences that actually set us apart. So the question is why that is the case. Across all the panels that we've seen, one obvious thing is that we obviously differ as to the interpretations of what is happening. We have some parallel narratives, and this regards very many areas that we've covered, and whereas in some areas it can be understandable, but in international law, for instance, where the claim by one of the participants was that we have only one unitary international law, I think the degree of this diversion was the biggest. Why is that the case? It's either we don't want to understand each other for some reason because we want different things, we have different interests. It may be because we have different information and we don't trust the sources of the data that our opposite party provides. Like in the case of Syria, for instance, that we obviously differed on the nature of the developments in Syria. Or we have a value conflict. And Professor Chatner was speaking to this issue of the value conflict, and that we have different value codes and we need time to overcome that. And he was hopeful that this is actually possible. But then he didn't specify how much time we need to overcome. But sometimes, even when we have the facts, we still do differ. For instance, when Dan said that one of the reasons behind the sanction policy was to enforce the norm of peaceful territorial change, I would say that Russia thinks that the Crimean case was the perfect example of the enforcement of the norm of peaceful territorial change, while the Donbas case is an example of unpeaceful events but without any territorial change. Now the question is, what should we do to somehow overcome this self-inducing dynamic of talking about confrontation, even when the deliberate goal is to talk about cooperation? Do we really need to wait for the time when we can assure the genuine meeting of minds to overcome that value conflict of which Professor Tatyana was talking? What is necessary to actually work together? And these two conferences, I think, demonstrated that when we tackle bigger issues, which actually address the fundamentals of our mindsets, it's practically impossible to start talking about cooperative issues. So the format, when we cover all the areas, just in 75 minutes, actually promotes more discontent and confrontation than cooperation. So our idea with Dan was for future conferences to focus on something more specific and actually try and within maybe the same amount of time, maybe less, I hope, at least get to the point when we agree on the basic facts, when we agree on the basic approaches, when we do know for sure what's going on, and then try to work out bit by bit some common positions. And I think bringing in students into this and hearing out their perspectives is very important. I think the American colleagues saw that there is actually quite a lot of diversity in the way we Russians treat the issues, especially the economic section, I think, was quite illuminating in this respect. But it also takes place in many other issues. We tend to simplify, and this is what theorists do, we tend to simplify the reality. I will cite this example. At the panel on non-state threats and counterterrorism, one of the reasons why people join ISIS was named actually struggle for justice, or looking for justice, fighting for justice. But we shouldn't also disregard the other dynamic which is taking place, and I take it from my personal experience, talking in 2014 when the ruble plummeted. I was talking to a Tajik guy who was working in my country house, and he said that, well, I'm thinking about not coming to you next year because of the economic situation. Maybe I'll join ISIS. And for him it was a very clear, pragmatic and economically driven choice. No justice was involved. And I looked at him, I couldn't quite get whether he was joking or actually telling one of the options that he was considering, but he seemed quite serious about it. It actually means that there is a whole bunch of people thinking the same way, because for him it's obviously one of the options on the table. So I think not simplifying is very important, but not simplifying in 75 minutes is impossible. So I think this was a great experience, but I definitely think that for future conferences we should somehow narrow down and work more precisely and in a more focused manner on some concrete issues. But without these two broad conferences, this transition would have not been possible. Thank you very much.
Hopefully we are going to end early even, not just on time. I would also like to thank Andrei, and also, just as important, Andrei's staff here at MGIMO, which has been, the word I believe, which is Russian, is stakhanovite, in terms of effort promoted to make sure the conferences run smoothly, even though it's been rather long. So thank you, not just Andrei, but to everyone at MGIMO who has made this work reasonably well. Like Andrei, in theory, this conference was to be more about issues of cooperation as opposed to the fall one, which was about conflict, and yet there was still some conflict, or at least divergence of opinion here. And what I kept thinking about as this was going on was a quote that I believe it was Winston Churchill who first said it, and then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis also said it more recently, which is that the thing about the United States is that the United States tends to do the right thing once we exhaust all other possibilities. And that's in some ways the genius of American democracy. I would suggest that would also potentially apply to the nature of the bilateral relationship between Russia and the United States, which is to say that there has certainly been a long period in which Russia and the United States have had conflict over the last 2 centuries. But you can argue that it takes a while for both sides to exhaust all other possible alternatives to realize that maybe there can be some cooperation, whether we're talking about the run-up to World War II, in which the U.S. was excessively isolationist and perhaps the USSR was excessively particularly optimistic about a treaty with the Nazis, with the Cold War, in which the United States exaggerated the threat coming from the Soviet bloc, and the USSR exaggerated the weakness of the United States in the post-Vietnam era. In the 1980s, in which the U.S. was, I think, too wary of Gorbachev for too long of a time. And similarly, Gorbachev, before trying perestroika, tried abertura, and that did not work terribly well. And certainly we can describe the post-Cold War period as, in that way as well. Does that mean things are hopeless? And no, here I also agree with Andre that I don't think there are. And ideally, this is supposed to be the role that experts can play, I think, in terms of potentially setting a template for the future of the bilateral relationship. Andre, in talking about the relationship between disagreements over facts, to quote another American, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he once said that you are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. And I think one of the problems with the state of the bilateral relationship is that even among experts there is potentially disagreement, not necessarily over all the facts, but which facts are the really important ones. And to some extent, I think I agree with Andre that in future conferences, the idea is that if we focus on a narrower set of issues, rather than try to solve everything with respect to, let's say, the economy in 75 minutes, or in terms of soft power than 75 minutes, we focus on one issue over a somewhat shorter day than today, but still, a day-long conference, and maybe we can make out progress. And if nothing else, I think one of the advantages of expertise or shared expertise across borders, there's two things at this point. The first is that if experts can't necessarily agree on what the right thing is to do, usually experts are pretty good at figuring out what the wrong thing to do is. And so hopefully, going forward, there could be consensus on courses of action that would be negative, not just to the United States or to Russia, but to the world more generally. And the second thing, and I will leave it with this, is that in some ways, thinking about the Russian-American relationship right now, I think the advantage for all experts is that we're buying low, which is to say that if we think about the state of the relationship bilaterally, it doesn't look terribly promising right now. But on the other hand, that means there are still opportunities to potentially make it a better relationship going forward. And indeed, it is precisely in these moments when I think that experts should not follow the course of public opinion. It is exactly this moment when you want to stand against the tide of public opinion, against the tide of uninformed people who nonetheless talk a lot on television, and say that there might actually be grounds for cooperation going forward. And so I will close with that note, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dan. I would like to thank you as a very devoted and professional partner with whom it's a real pleasure to work. And all the American guests, we're really grateful to you for coming here. To those of you who have agreed to do these short courses, for those of you who agreed to travel for the first time, to explore the unknown, because apparently it can be kind of worrying to travel to a country for which the State Department says reconsider travel. So, and also I would like all of you to join me in thanking the simultaneous interpreters who've been working for 12 hours in the booth. And all the Russian speakers and all the students who've been very perseverant in asking questions and showing genuine interest. So as promised, there will be now standing reception in the hall. Thank you all very much for coming.